Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
this happened a few years ago, and I still can't explain what I experienced. My friends and I were in high school, and one weekend, we decided to explore the old amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been shut down for decades, ever since a freak accident on one of the rides. Everyone in town said it was cursed, but we just thought it was an exciting, creepy place to explore. We snuck in after dark, armed with flashlights and the confidence only teenagers have. The place was eerie, rusted rides creaked in the wind, faded clown faces leered from peeling murals, and weeds had overtaken what used to be a bustling carnival. At first, it was just harmless fun. We dared each other to climb onto the old Ferris wheel, poked around the decaying ticket booths, and laughed at how spooky the place felt. But then, things started to feel, well, it began when we found the carousel. It was in surprisingly good shape compared to the rest of the park. The horses were dusty but intact, their painted eyes glossy and too lifelike. One of my friends, Chris, dared me to sit on one of the horses for a picture. As soon as I climbed on, I swear I heard a faint tune, like a music box, coming from the carousel, but the others swore they didn't hear anything. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. We moved on to the funhouse, which had partially collapsed but was still standing enough for us to venture inside. That's when things took a darker turn. As we navigated the maze of warped mirrors, our flashlights began to flicker. We joked that it was just bad batteries, but when all four of our lights went out simultaneously, the joking stopped. We stood there in total darkness, the air feeling thick and oppressive. Then, out of nowhere, we heard footsteps. Not ours, and not the soft shuffling of an animal. These were deliberate, heavy steps echoing through the funhouse. We froze, listening as the steps grew louder, closer. Someone whispered, "Run." We bolted, tripping over debris and each other in our rush to escape. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps seemed to keep pace with us, always just a few feet behind. When we finally burst out of the funhouse and into the open air, we didn't stop. We ran all the way to the fence we climbed earlier and scrambled over it, panting and terrified. Only once we were safely outside did we look back. That's when we saw it. Standing in the doorway of the funhouse was a figure. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its glowing eyes reflected the moonlight. We never went back to that park, and we don't talk about that night anymore. Sometimes I wonder if it was just our imaginations running wild, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. After that night, we all tried to move on. None of us talked about what had happened at the amusement park. It was like we had some unspoken agreement to bury it and pretend it never happened. But for me, the nightmares started almost immediately. At first, they were vague, just flashes of the figure standing in the doorway of the funhouse, its glowing eyes boring into me. But over time, the dreams became more vivid. I'd find myself back at the park, wandering alone. The rides would be spinning and moving as if the park was alive, even though it was empty. And then I'd hear the footsteps, always behind me, always getting closer. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The worst dream came about a month after our visit. In it, I was standing in front of the carousel. The music was playing again, louder this time, and the horses were moving on their own, bobbing up and down as if invisible children were riding them. I tried to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My feet were stuck to the ground. That's when I saw it. The figure from the funhouse was sitting on one of the horses, its unnaturally long arms draped over the poles. It wasn't looking at me at first, but then its head snapped toward me in one sudden, jerky motion. Its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I heard it laugh, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in my ears even after I woke up. After that dream, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I called Chris, desperate to know if he'd experienced anything similar. He was reluctant to talk at first, but eventually he admitted that he'd been having nightmares too. So had the others. Chris also told me something I didn't know: the carousel wasn't supposed to be there. According to him, the park never had a carousel when it was opened. He'd asked his dad, who grew up in the area, and he was certain that carousel shouldn't have existed. That's when I decided we needed answers. Against my better judgment, I convinced Chris and one of our other friends, Mia, to go back to the park with me during the day. I told myself it would be less scary in the daylight, that we could investigate without the overwhelming fear we felt that night. When we got there, the park looked just as abandoned as before, but something was different. The carousel, the pristine, creepy carousel, was gone. In its place was an overgrown patch of dirt, like it had never been there at all. Chris looked pale, and Mia kept muttering, "This doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense." We wandered around for a while, but there was no sign of the carousel. It was like it had vanished. But just as we were about to leave, we heard it, the faint sound of a music box coming from somewhere deeper in the park. My stomach turned to ice and we all froze. The sound grew louder and then the footsteps started again. This time, we didn't wait to see anything. We ran faster than we ever run before and we didn't stop until we were in the car, speeding away from that cursed place. I tried everything to drown out the nightmares and the memories. White noise machines, therapy, even burning sage around my room. Nothing worked. The music box tuned and the footsteps became part of my life, creeping into the corners of my mind when I least expected it. But it didn't stop with me. About 3 months after our second trip to the park, Mia disappeared. Her mom called me, frantic, asking if I'd seen her or if I knew where she might have gone. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, but when her mom mentioned that Mia had been acting strange before she vanished, saying things like I need to go back and stop it, I felt the blood drain from my face. I called Chris immediately and he sounded just as shaken. "You don't think she went back, do you?" he asked. "She wouldn't," I replied, but even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe myself. Chris and I decided to go to her house to look for clues. In her room, everything seemed normal at first glance, but then we found her journal. The last few entries sent chills down my spine. Entry 1, I can hear the music box during the day now. It's not just in my dreams. Am I going crazy? I swear it's getting louder. Entry 2, I saw the figure today. It was standing at the end of my driveway, just watching me. No one else saw it. I think it's calling me back to the park. Final entry, I have to go back. I think it wants me to. Maybe if I go, it'll leave me alone. Maybe it'll leave all of us alone. They called the police and told them everything, but they didn't take us seriously. To them, Mia was just a troubled teenager who probably ran away. But Chris and I knew better. We decided to go back to the park ourselves, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay away. This time, we brought a crowbar and a flashlight each. We weren't planning to fight anything, we just wanted to bring Mia back. The park was even more decrepit than before, but as we stepped inside, the air felt thick and charged, like a thunderstorm was about to hit. We called out for Mia, our voices echoing in the empty space. That's when the music started again. It was louder now, echoing from somewhere deep in the park. We followed the sound, our flashlights trembling in our hands. When we reached the spot where the carousel used to be, we froze. It was back. The carousel stood there, pristine and spinning slowly, even though there was no one on it. The horses bobbed up and down in time with the haunting tune, and there, sitting on one of the horses, was Mia. Her head hung low, and her hands were gripping the pole tightly. "Mia," I shouted, but she didn't respond. Chris and I ran toward her, but as soon as we stepped closer, the air around the carousel seemed to ripple like a heat wave. The figure appeared again, stepping out from behind one of the horses. It was taller than I remembered, its limbs bending and twisting unnaturally. Its glowing eyes bored into us, and I swear I heard that same guttural laugh, louder now, vibrating in my chest. Chris froze, but I kept moving, yelling Mia's name. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy like she wasn't really there. The figure raised one impossibly long arm, pointing at me. The music grew deafening, and the carousel began spinning faster, the horses blurring into a whirlwind of color. Chris grabbed my arm and yanked me back just as the ground beneath the carousel cracked open. Black smoke poured out, and the figure stepped toward us, its body stretching and distorting as it moved. "We have to go," Chris screamed, dragging me away. I didn't want to leave Mia, but something about the figure, the smoke, the music, it felt like we wouldn't survive if we stayed. We ran. I don't remember how we got out of the park, but when we did, the music stopped abruptly. We turned back, and the park was silent. The carousel, the figure, and Mia, everything was gone. Mia was never found. The police labeled it a runaway case, but Chris and I knew the truth. The park had taken her. Chris moved away a few months later. He said he couldn't stay in a town so close to that place. As for me, I've done my best to move on, but I know the park isn't finished with me. I've been reading this subreddit for a while, but never thought I'd have something to contribute. This happened a few months ago during my graveyard shift at the small regional airport where I work. It still gives me chills every time I think about it. For context, I work security at a mid-sized airport that only runs commercial flights during the day. At night, it's mostly cargo and private flights. My shift starts at 11 p.m. and ends at 7 a.m. by midnight. The terminal is practically deserted, with only a skeleton crew of us patrolling the building. This particular night was no different. Around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my rounds at the terminal. The place was dead silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. The lighting was dim, as they turn off most of the overheads after the last commercial flight departs. It was eerie, sure, but I'm used to it. I was walking past gate 7 when I noticed something odd. A woman was sitting in one of the chairs by the window. She was facing away from me, looking out at the dark tarmac. Her hair was long and unkempt, like she hadn't combed it in days, and she was wearing an outdated flight attendant uniform, something I'd only seen in old airline ads from the 70 seconds. I thought it was strange because I hadn't seen her come in and no private flights were scheduled until morning. I called out. She didn't move. I walked closer, trying to keep my voice calm. Ma'am, the terminal is closed. Can I help you find your way out? Still, no response. She didn't even flinch. As I got closer, I started to notice something wasn't right. Her hair looked almost too black, like ink, and her skin was so pale it almost glowed under the dim emergency lights. But what really got me was her reflection in the window. He wasn't there. I stopped dead in my tracks. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the angle, maybe the glass was dirty, but no matter how much I shifted, there was no reflection of her in the window. Just me, standing there like an idiot. I called again, my voice cracking. This time, she turned her head slowly toward me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her eyes, they weren't eyes. They were just black pits, like someone had hollowed them out. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide. I don't remember running, but the next thing I knew, I was in the security office, slamming the door shut and locking it. My coworker, Danny, was sitting at the desk eating chips. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. He laughed it off, saying I must have been half asleep. But when I insisted, he humored me and pulled up the security cameras. Here's the thing, the camera for gate 7 showed me standing there, talking to thin air. No shadow, nothing. Danny teased me about it for the rest of the night, but I swear on my life, I saw her. I've been working at the airport for 5 years, and nothing like this has ever happened before or since. After that night, things at the airport started to feel different. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things that were easy to brush off at first. My radio would occasionally pick up static, even when I was standing close to the base station. Lights in the terminal would flicker, but only around gate 7, and sometimes, when I was alone on my rounds, I'd get the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I didn't tell anyone else about it. Danny already thought I was crazy, and I wasn't about to give the rest of the crew any ammunition to joke about. But I started keeping a journal of all the weird things that happened. One night, about 2 weeks after I saw her, I found something in the gate 7 seating area. It was an old flight manual, the kind pilots used before everything went digital. The thing was battered and yellowed, and it had the logo of an airline I'd never heard of, Skylark Aviation. Furious, I looked it up when I got home, but I couldn't find anything. No records of the airline, no old advertisements, nothing. It was like it had never existed. I brought the manual to work the next night to show Danny. "Where'd you find this?" he asked, flipping through it. "Gate 7, I told him." He gave me a weird look. "This thing's ancient. Probably just something a passenger left behind years ago." But that didn't make sense. The terminal gets cleaned top to bottom every night, and this manual looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Still, I didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was reading too much into it. That same night, around 3 AM, the fire alarm went off in the terminal. It wasn't uncommon for the system to glitch, so Danny and I split up to check the building. I headed toward the main concourse, and Danny went to the cargo area. When I got to gate 7, the alarm was blaring so loudly that it felt like my skull would split. I was about to turn back when I saw her again, the same woman sitting in the exact same spot as before. This time, she was turned toward me, her hollow eyes locked on mine. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression was blank, almost sad. "Who are you?" I shouted over the alarm. "What do you want?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her arm and pointed toward the window. My heart was pounding as I turned to look, and that's when I saw it, a plane, partially obscured by fog, sitting on the farthest runway. It was old, like something out of a history book, and the Skylark Aviation logo was painted on the tail. The thing that really made my stomach drop was the condition of the plane. It was rusted, corroded, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. The alarm abruptly stopped, plunging the terminal into an eerie silence. When I turned back to the woman, she was gone. I radioed Danny and told him what I'd seen. He thought I was joking, but I convinced him to come out to the tarmac with me. When we got there, the plane was gone. There wasn't even a sign it had been there, no tire marks, no condensation from the fog, nothing. After that, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I asked one of the older employees, Linda, if she'd ever heard of Skylark Aviation. Her face went pale. "Don't talk about that," she said. "It's bad luck." I pressed her for more information, and after some hesitation, she told me about a crash that happened decades ago. A Skylark Aviation flight had gone down shortly after takeoff, killing everyone on board. The wreckage was never recovered, and for years, there were rumors that the flight was cursed. Since Linda told me about the crash, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I started digging into old records, hoping to find more information about Skylark Aviation and the crash she mentioned. Unfortunately, it wasn't easy. Skylark seemed to be a ghost of an airline. No articles, no official history, nothing. Finally, after weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a thread in an old aviation forum. Someone had posted about ghost flights and mentioned Skylark Aviation Flight 93. According to them, the flight was carrying 74 passengers and 5 crew members when it vanished after departing from the very airport where I work. The official report stated that the wreckage was never recovered and the cause of the crash was labeled as unknown. But what really made my skin crawl were the comments. One user claimed to have worked at the airport years ago and mentioned strange sightings near Gate 7. Another described seeing a phantom plane on the tarmac late at night, just like I had. Someone else mentioned an old legend. The souls of the passengers and crew were still trying to complete their flight, stuck between the living and the dead. I should have stopped there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do something I regret. The next time I worked the graveyard shift, I brought a small digital recorder with me. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe some static, maybe nothing at all, but I had to try. At around 2:45 a.m., I set up the recorder at Gate 7 and started asking questions. Is anyone here? What happened to Flight 93? Do you need help? I waited in silence, feeling ridiculous, but then I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so quiet I thought I imagined it, but when I played back the recording, it was there, a voice soft and broken, saying, "We're lost." My blood ran cold. I kept listening, and a second voice came through, this one distorted and low. "Help us." I yanked the recorder away like it had burned me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being watched. That's when I noticed something else. The windows overlooking the tarmac had fogged up, and there were handprints on the glass, handprints from the outside. I bolted. I left the recorder behind and didn't look back until I was safe in the security office. Danny wasn't on shift that night, so I had no one to talk to, no one to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I spent the rest of my shift watching the monitors, and nothing unusual happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The next day, I called in sick. I needed time to process what had happened, but when I finally worked up the courage to check the security logs from that night, the recording was gone. So was the recorder. The airport's been eerily quiet since then. No more flickering lights, no strange smells, no shadows in the corner of my eye. It's almost like they're gone, like whatever was tied to Gate 7 finally found what they were looking for, or someone. I haven't decided if I'll quit yet, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go near Gate 7 again. And if you ever find yourself at a small regional airport late at night, be careful where you wander. You might find more than you bargained for. For context, I was a college student at the time, traveling back to my hometown for the weekend. My bus was scheduled to leave late at night, around 11:45 p.m., from a rarely used terminal on the outskirts of the city. The terminal was ancient and eerily quiet when I arrived, cracked tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify every tiny sound. There was no one at the ticket counter, just a sign saying, "Tickets can be purchased on the bus." Weird, but whatever. I figured I'd wait by the boarding area until it was time to leave. About 10 minutes in, a man came out of the shadows from behind the vending machines. I hadn't seen or heard an approach, which was odd considering how quiet the place was. He was dressed in outdated clothing, like something straight out of the 1940s, and he held a newspaper folded neatly under his arm. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes. They didn't seem right. They were too wide, too bright, like they were reflecting light that wasn't there. "Waiting for the Midnight Express?" he asked, his voice strangely formal. I nodded and mumbled something about the bus running late. He smiled, an unsettling, too wide grin, and sat on the bench across from me. For a while, he didn't say anything, just kept staring at me with those unblinking eyes. I tried to focus on my phone, but the Wi-Fi was spotty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. "Not many people take this route anymore," he said suddenly. "It's not safe. You know, things happen on this road." I didn't respond, just shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The terminal was so empty that even the sound of a distant vending machine dropping a soda felt deafening. I was desperate for someone else to show up, anyone, but no one came yet. Then, the man pulled out the newspaper he'd been carrying and unfolded it slowly. It looked ancient, yellow with age. He held it out to me, and I reluctantly took it. The headline said that chilled down my spine, "Bus crash leaves 18 dead in freak accident." The date on the paper was from decades ago. I looked up to ask him where he'd gotten it, but he was gone. I mean, completely gone. No footsteps, no sound of a door creaking open, just vanished. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe he'd gone to the bathroom or something, but I couldn't shake the unease. At 11:45 on the dot, the bus finally pulled in and I was the only passenger to board. The driver gave me a strange look as I handed him my money like he wasn't expecting anyone. The ride was uneventful at first. I kept thinking about that man in the newspaper. When I looked out the window, though, I noticed something strange. The same landmarks kept repeating: an old diner, a rusted out billboard, a lone street lamp flickering in the dark. At first, I thought I was just tired, but after the third time seeing the same diner, I knew something was wrong. I approached the driver and asked him why we weren't making progress. He didn't answer at first, just kept staring straight ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and almost mechanical. "This route doesn't go anywhere." I stumbled back to my seat, my heart racing. The landmarks outside the window had stopped repeating. Instead, the road was lined with shadowy figures standing perfectly still, their faces obscure. They all turned to look at the bus as we passed, their heads moving in eerie unison. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually I must have blacked out. When I woke up, I was sitting on a bench outside the terminal, the morning sun shining down on me. The bus was gone, the terminal was locked up, and my luggage was nowhere to be found. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. I tried looking up the accident from the newspaper, but I couldn't find any record of it. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed the whole thing, until I remember the driver's chilling words: "This route doesn't go anywhere." After waking up on the bench, I tried to piece everything together. My phone was still in my pocket, but it was dead, no battery left, though I had charged it fully before heading to the terminal. I glanced around the deserted parking lot, hoping someone would show up, but it was as empty as the night before. Eventually, I decided to walk. The city was only a few miles away, and the sun made everything feel less threatening. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had just dozed off waiting for the bus and dreamed everything else. That seemed plausible enough, even if the dream had been unnervingly vivid. When I got back to campus, my first priority was to charge my phone and figure out what had happened to my belongings. As soon as the phone turned on, it started blowing up with missed calls and texts. The first text I saw froze my blood, from my mom, sent at 2:03 a.m. "Are you okay? I just saw something horrible on the news about a bus crash." There were others, from friends and family, asking if I was safe, asking why I wasn't answering, asking why my location had disappeared from our shared tracking app. Confused, I googled bus crash near. The first result made my stomach drop. Fatal bus accident on Old Mill Road, 20 dead, 1 missing. I clicked on the article, scanning it in disbelief. The crash had occurred the same night I was at the terminal, involving the exact route I was supposed to take. The article described how the bus had veered off a cliff on a sharp turn. Most of the passengers and the driver were declared dead at the scene. One body, however, was never recovered. They listed my name as the missing person. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. How could I have been listed as a passenger when I never boarded? Unless I thought back to the man with the newspaper, his pale face, his cryptic warning. Things happen on this road. Had he known what was going to happen? Or had he been something else entirely, something not human? But the worst part wasn't the article, it was the photo included at the bottom. A photo of the crash site, showing the wreckage of the bus in the ravine below. The charred remains of luggage and seats were scattered everywhere, and among them was something that made my blood run cold. It was my backpack, unmistakably mine, sitting among the debris. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night, not my family, not my friends. I said I missed the bus, lied about leaving my stuff behind at the terminal. I even stopped going home for weekends, opting to stay on campus no matter what. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that man, about his strange smile, his old-fashioned clothes, about how he disappeared without a sound. Weeks turned into months, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. It felt like a weight I carried everywhere I went. Every time I tried to move on, some small detail would drag me back into the fear. Like the time I walked past a newspaper stand and saw a headline about another accident, eerily similar to mine. Or the late night dreams where I was back on the bus, surrounded by shadowy passengers, the driver's voice echoing, "This route doesn't go anywhere." But the strangest part came about 6 months later. I'd started taking evening classes to fill my time and avoid any unnecessary travel. One night, as I was leaving campus, I noticed a bus idling at the curb near the entrance. It was old, not like the modern city buses, but one of those retro models with faded paint and a cracked destination sign. The display simply read, "Final stop." I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a private charter or some vintage collector's project. But as I walked past, the driver leaned out of the window. It was the same man from the terminal. He didn't say anything this time, just gave me that same too-wide grin, his bright eyes locking onto mine. My legs froze, and for a moment, it felt like the world around me had gone silent. No passing cars, no voices, nothing. Then he spoke, his voice clear and cold. "You missed your passenger stopped last time. Care to try again? Panic surged through me, and I bolted in the opposite direction, not stopping until I was safely back in my dorm room. I locked the door, my heart pounding, my chest tight. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a notification from the local transit app, a bus schedule update. The message made my hands shake. New route added, Midnight Express, last stop, Old Mill Road. I deleted the app on the spot. After that, I couldn't sleep properly for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the man's face or hear the whispery voices of unseen passengers. I became obsessed with figuring out what had happened to me. I pored over every article about the crash, visited forums, even looked into local folklore about the road and the terminal. What I found didn't make me feel any better. Apparently, Old Mill Road had a reputation for being cursed. Over the decades, there had been numerous reports of accidents, strange sightings, and disappearances. One story stuck with me. Back in the 1940s, a bus full of passengers disappeared without a trace on that very route. Witnesses claimed they saw the bus driving into the terminal, but it never came out. Some people believe the passengers were still riding, trapped in some kind of loop, forever reliving their last moments. The description of the missing bus matched the one I'd seen that night outside campus. Now, every time I see a bus, any bus, I feel a chill run down my spine. I've stopped using public transportation altogether, relying on rideshares or walking no matter how inconvenient. It's safer that way, at least that's what I tell myself. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll hear the distant hum of an engine outside my window. I'll peek through the blinds and see a shadowy bus, its headlights glowing faintly in the dark. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a local theme park that was celebrating its off-season by keeping a few attractions open late. The weather was damp, and a light drizzle had scared off most of the crowd, so the place was eerily empty. It was kind of fun at first, no lines, the sound of distant screams from the coasters echoing into the night. There was one ride I had always loved but rarely got to go on because the lines were so long, the old haunted boat ride. You know the type, dimly lit tunnels, animatronic ghosts, cheesy sound effects. My friends were into it, so I decided to go solo while they hit up the nearby roller coaster. When I got to the ride, there was no one else in line. The ride operator, a tired-looking teenage girl, barely looked up from her phone as she waved me toward a rickety boat. The whole thing was a big rundown, but I shrugged it off. It was all part of the charm, right? The boat drifted into the darkness, and the usual animatronic figures popped up, a skeleton here, a ghoul there. It was cheesy, just like I remembered, but as I got further into the tunnel, the atmosphere shifted, the air felt colder, and the fog machines were so thick I could barely see a foot in front of me. That's when I noticed something strange. The animatronics were moving slower than they should have been, almost jerking unnaturally, like their mechanisms were glitching. One figure, a pirate skeleton, turned its head toward me, and for a split second, I could swear its eyes were plastic. They looked wet, human, and I laughed nervously, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But then I heard it. Footsteps, not the click and whir of the ride's machinery, but soft, wet footsteps, like someone barefoot was walking on the damp floor of the tunnel. They seemed to echo all around me, getting closer. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there, just the thick fog and the dim glow of flickering lights. The boat suddenly jerked to a stop. Hello, I called out, my voice shaky. No response. The footsteps grew louder, and now I could hear something else, faint whispering. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, their words indecipherable but urgent. Panic set in as I tried to push the boat forward manually, but it wouldn't budge. The ride had apparently stalled, and I was trapped in the middle of the tunnel. That's when I saw it. A figure emerged from the fog, standing perfectly still on the edge of the water. It wasn't an animatronic, I'm sure of it. It was too tall, too real. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out its arms, which were unnaturally long and ended in claw-like fingers. They tilted its head, as if studying me. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from it. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded ancient, wrong. I screamed, kicking at the water to try to get the boat to move. Suddenly, the ride jolted back to life, and the boat surged forward. The figure didn't follow, it just stood there, watching me with that unnatural stillness. When I finally emerged into the open air, the ride operator looked up, startled. "Whoa, are you okay?" she asked, clearly confused by my panicked state. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just frowned and shook her head. "No one else is in there. It's been empty all night." After a week of avoiding the topic, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw, or whatever it was, wasn't just a glitchy animatronic or a random hallucination. My dreams were plagued by those whispers, a chorus of unintelligible words that felt closer to a chant. Sometimes, I woke up sweating, convinced I heard faint footsteps in my hallway. Then, about 2 weeks after the theme park trip, I got a message on my phone from an unknown number. The text was simple: "Did you like the ride?" I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. I replied with a cautious, "Who is this?" They got no response. After a while, I convinced myself it was just a prank and blocked the number. But things didn't stop there. A few nights later, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I heard something strange. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the show. But as I turned the volume down, I realized it was unmistakable, those same whispers, low and fragmented, coming from inside my house. I grabbed my phone and stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room, near the window. My curtains were drawn, but the sound was clearer now, words I still couldn't understand but that made my skin crawl. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to find a prankster or maybe some kind of malfunctioning speaker, but there was nothing there, just the empty street outside. The whisper stopped. The next morning, I called one of my friends who had been at the theme park with me. I tried to play it off casually, asking if they had noticed anything weird about the place or heard any strange stories. To my surprise, my friend got quiet. "Actually," she said, "I didn't want to freak you out, but when we were leaving, I swear I saw someone standing by the entrance to that ride. Like, a really tall guy. He was just standing there, staring at you as we walked by. I figured it was just some weird employee or something, but now," she trailed off, clearly unsettled. That's when I decided to do some digging. I looked up the history of the theme park, trying to find any stories about accidents, hauntings, anything that might explain what happened. And I found something. Years ago, before the haunted boat ride was installed, that part of the park used to house a different attraction, a wax museum. Apparently, it had been shut down after a tragic incident where one of the workers went missing. According to the articles I found, he was last seen in the tunnels beneath the exhibit, which were repurposed when the boat ride was built. Some people claimed the park covered it up, saying he'd run away, but others believed he died down there. The strangest part, witnesses who worked there at the time claimed they heard whispers and footsteps in the tunnels for weeks after he disappeared. Things only got worse after my research. I started noticing little things around my house that didn't feel right. Objects weren't where I left them. Doors I knew I'd closed would be slightly ajar. At first, I thought I was being paranoid until I started hearing the whispers again. They didn't stay confined to the house. Sometimes, I'd hear them in the grocery store or while walking to my car after work. Always faint, just on the edge of perception, but always the same, those overlapping, incomprehensible voices. No one else seemed to notice. Then one night, I woke up to something that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. It was around 3 a.m. and the room was dead silent. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing. But something felt off. I turned over in bed, half asleep, and froze. My bedroom window, which I always kept locked, was wide open. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the room. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light swept across the room, revealing nothing out of place at first. Then I noticed something on the floor by the window. Larger, small, white footprints led from the window to the foot of my bed. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the tracks, trying to convince myself that I was dreaming. But when I reached out and touched the floor, the water was real, cold, soaking into the carpet. I bolted out of bed and turned on every light in the house, checking every room, every closet, every corner. No one was there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I called out of work and decided to visit the theme park again, as much as the thought terrified me. I needed answers, closure, something. When I got there, the place looked as run down as ever. A few rides were operating, but the haunted boat ride was closed. A man in a maintenance uniform was standing near the entrance, and I decided to ask him about it. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual. "What happened to the boat ride? Is it under repair?" He looked at me, confused. "That ride's been shut down for months," he said. "We had some electrical issues and a small fire last year. Haven't reopened it since." My stomach dropped. "But I went on it 2 weeks ago," I said, my voice shaking. The man's expression darkened. "Impossible," he said. "There's no way anyone could have gone on that ride. It's been sealed off." I stumbled away, my mind racing. If the ride wasn't operational, then what had I been on? That night, the whispers came back, louder than ever. They seemed to surround me, filling every corner of the house. I tried playing music, turning on the TV, anything to drown them out, but nothing worked. And then I saw it, standing in the hallway, just out of the corner of my eye. The figure from the boat ride. Its long arms and shadowy face were unmistakable. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. I grabbed my car keys and ran out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door. I drove to a friend's place and stayed there for the night, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this thing is, it's not tied to the park or the ride. It's tied to me. I live in a small town, and my job requires me to travel to a bigger city every week. It's about a 2-hour train ride each way, and I usually use that time to catch up on podcasts or read. On this particular evening, I had stayed late for a work meeting, so I ended up on the last train home. The train was nearly empty, save for a few other late-night commuters scattered across the cars. I picked a seat by the window in an empty section and settled in with my headphones. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed a man sitting a few rows ahead of me, facing the opposite direction. I hadn't seen him board, and I was sure I'd chosen an empty car. He was wearing an old, tattered coat and a hat pulled low over his face. His clothes looked out of place, like they belonged to someone from another time. I tried to ignore him, chalking it up to my exhaustion, but something about him felt wrong. He wasn't moving, just sitting completely still, like a statue. About halfway through the ride, the train stopped at a station to let a few passengers off. When we started moving again, I glanced back to the man, but he was gone. I thought maybe he had gotten off without me noticing. Relieved, I put my headphones back on and leaned against the window. That's when I felt it, a presence. You know how you just know when someone is staring at you. Slowly, I turned my head, and there he was, sitting in the seat directly across the aisle from me. I froze. He hadn't made a sound, and there was no reason for him to move seats like that. His head was still tilted down, the brim of his hat hiding his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. No response. The train rattled on, the sound of the wheels on the tracks unnervingly loud in the silence. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no service, and the conductor wasn't anywhere nearby. I tried to ignore him, telling myself he was just a strange but harmless guy. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him slowly turn his head to face me. I looked directly at him for the first time, and my stomach dropped. His face, it wasn't right. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked like a corpse, but his lips twitched into a slight grin when he saw my reaction. I jumped out of my seat and bolted toward the next car. I didn't look back until I reached the door, and when I did, he was standing in the aisle, watching me. Not running, just standing there, smiling. I ran through 2 more cars before I found a group of passengers. Gasping for breath, I told them what had happened. The man offered to go back with me to confront the guy, but when we returned to my car, it was empty. The only thing left behind was a single, worn-out train ticket on my seat. The date on it was from 1946. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the experience. It felt like a stain on my memory, one I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. I stopped commuting by train altogether, opting to drive instead. It was inconvenient and added time to my day, but the thought of stepping back onto that train sent shivers down my spine. But here's the thing, avoiding the train didn't stop the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of that man. In my dreams, he was always sitting across from me, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. I could feel his eyes on me, though I never dared to look up. Sometimes, I'd hear his low, raspy breathing. Other times, he'd grin that awful grin, his lips curly like he knew something I didn't. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom freezing cold. It was the middle of summer, but the air was icy enough to make me see my breath. I thought my air conditioning had gone haywire, but when I reached for my phone to check the thermostat, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A worn-out train ticket was lying on my nightstand. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to believe it was real. Instead, I grabbed my keys and bolted out of my apartment, driving to a friend's house in the middle of the night. I stayed there for 2 days, too scared to go home. When I finally mustered the courage to return, the ticket was gone. I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, stress piling up and playing tricks on me. But then, the incident started happening again. I'd catch glimpses of him in my peripheral vision, in the reflection of a shop window or a car mirror as I walked through parking lots. Always the same coat, the same hat pulled low. Each time I turned to look, he wasn't there, but the feeling lingered, that awful, gut-wrenching sense of being watched. It got worse when I started hearing him. Late at night, as I tried to sleep, I'd hear the faint sound of train wheels clattering on tracks. At first, it was so quiet I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder as the nights went on. Then came the whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs, like someone sitting at the edge of my bed, muttering under their breath. I could never make out what he was saying, but the tone was cold and mocking, like he was laughing at me. The final straw came last week. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, the faint sound of train wheels echoing in my ears. My room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight streaming through the window. As I sat up, trying to calm my breathing, I saw him. He was standing in the corner of my bedroom, his silhouette framed by the faint light. The hat, the coat, the faint glint of his teeth as he smiled. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just sat there, frozen, as he slowly raised one hand and pointed at me. Then, without a sound, he disappeared. I don't know what he wants or why he's haunting me. I've tried looking into the history of the train line, but I haven't found anything that explains who or what he might be. All I know is that I can't escape him. No matter where I go, he follows. I started researching obsessively after that last encounter. If this thing train wasn't going to leave me alone. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I scoured forums, old news archives, and anything I could find about the train line, the ticket, and the strange figure I had encountered. Most of it was dead ends, urban legends about haunted stations, rumors about ghostly passengers. None of it felt real, and none of it matched my experience. Until I found the story. It was buried in an obscure blog about urban myths. The post was from 2011, and it described sightings of a shadowy man on the late train. The author claimed he always appeared in the last car, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, his face obscured. Most accounts ended with the figure vanishing, but one story stood out. A woman claimed the man had followed her off the train and into her home. Days later, she disappeared without a trace. Her apartment had been locked from the inside, and the only thing left behind was a faded train ticket dated decades earlier. My stomach dropped. It sounded too similar to my own experience to dismiss, but the post offered no solutions, no explanation, just a warning: don't interact with it, don't look at it, don't acknowledge it. I wish I'd read that earlier. The encounters grew more frequent after I read that blog. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt him standing there watching. The whispers became louder, more distinct, though the words were still incomprehensible. My friends started noticing something was wrong. I was jumpy, pale, barely coherent, but I couldn't tell them. Who would believe me? Then came the night I truly thought it was over. I was driving home late after visiting my parents. The highway was nearly empty, just an endless stretch of dark asphalt lit by my headlights. I had my music on low, trying to keep myself calm, when I saw something ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. As I approached, my heart sank. It was him. The hat, the coat, the impossible, empty face. He stood perfectly still, but as my car drew closer, he turned his head to look directly at me. I swerved instinctively, nearly losing control of the car. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I was shaky by the time I got home, but I couldn't sit in the driveway. I didn't feel safe anywhere. I locked myself in my house, every door and window bolted, and sat in the living room with every light on. My phone buzzed, and I jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. You can't run forever. I dropped the phone and backed away, heart pounding. Then I heard it, the sound of train wheels on tracks. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was deafening, like a freight train was barreling through my living room. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out, because I woke up hours later on the floor. The lights were still on, and the house was silent. My phone was lying next to me, its screen cracked, the text thread gone. Since that night, things have been quiet. Too quiet. No whispers, no sightings, no train tickets mysteriously appearing. You think I'd feel relief, but I don't. I feel like it's not over, like he's waiting for something, waiting for me to let my guard down. To anyone reading this, if you ever see a man on a train and a coat and hat that seem out of place, don't interact with them. Don't look at him, and whatever you do, don't let him follow you. I've never told anyone because it sounds insane, but writing it down here feels like the right thing to do. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, one of those cookie-cutter developments where every street looks the same and every lawn has the same shrubs and mulch. At the center of the neighborhood was a small park with a playground, a few picnic tables, and a rusty metal swing set. It was the kind of place kids played during the day, but no one ever visited after dark. It started one summer evening when I was 16. My parents were out for the night, and my younger sister was at a sleepover. I was supposed to stay home and be responsible, but my best friend, Jenna, convinced me to meet her at the park for an hour. She said she had something important to tell me, and I didn't think twice about it. When I got there, Jenna was nowhere in sight. The park was eerily empty. The streetlights along the road were on, but the ones near the playground flickered faintly or didn't work at all. I texted her, "Where are you?" No reply. I waited by the picnic tables for a few minutes, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach grew stronger. The air felt heavy. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creaking. My eyes shifted toward the swing set, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was sitting on one of the swings, gently swaying back and forth. She wore a white dress that seemed too clean, too perfect for the setting. Her head hung low, and her long dark hair covered her face. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound friendly. "Are you okay? Are you here alone?" She didn't answer. The creaking of the swing was the only sound. Something about her felt rugged. She wasn't swinging like a normal kid. It was more like she was being pushed, even though there was no one behind her. I stepped closer. That's when she stopped, dead still. Her head snapped up, and I froze. Her eyes, they were right. They were pitch black. No whites, no irises, just endless darkness. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle and said, in a voice that sounded far too deep for a child, "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. What? The swing creaked again, but this time, she wasn't moving. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me. I whipped around and saw nothing but shadows. When I turned back, the girl was gone. I don't know how I made it home, but I sprinted the whole way, my lungs burning and my skin crawly. When I finally burst through the front door and locked it behind me, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenna. Sorry, I can't make it. Felt grounded. Catch up tomorrow. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision or hear faint whispers when I was alone. At first, I thought it was paranoia, my brain playing tricks on me after the encounter at the park. But then things started happening around the house. It began with small, almost laughable incidents, lights flickering in my room, my alarm clock resetting itself, or the faint sound of creaking, like the swing set, outside my window at night. I told myself it was just faulty wiring or an overactive imagination. That all changed when I found the dirt. One morning, as I got ready for school, I noticed something odd on my bedroom floor. A trail of dirt and small twigs led from my window to my bed. The window was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. My parents thought it was one of the neighborhood cats that had somehow found its way in, though they couldn't explain how it had locked the window behind itself. I tried to convince myself they were right, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, I decided to stay up late and keep watch. I left my bedroom light off and sat in bed, staring at the window. Then night came and went, and nothing happened. I started to feel silly, like I was overreacting. But then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., I heard the faint creak of a swing. It was so quiet at first that I thought it was in my head, but then it grew louder, clearer, as if it were coming closer. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. She was there, the girl from the park, standing in my backyard, staring up at me. Her black eyes glinted in the faint moonlight, and her head was tilted at that same unnatural angle. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare back as she raised one pale hand and pointed directly at me. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds, minutes, it felt like an eternity. Then she vanished, as if she had never been there at all. But when I finally gathered the courage to check the window the next morning, I found tiny, child-sized footprints in the dirt beneath it. After that night, I begged my parents to move. They thought I was being dramatic, blaming it on teenage angst or an overactive imagination. But I didn't care. I stopped sleeping in my room altogether and started crashing on the couch in the living room. My grades slipped, and I withdrew from friends. Gina tried to talk to me about what was going on, but I couldn't find the words to explain it. How do you tell someone you're being haunted by a little girl who might not even be human? Eventually, my parents caved and decided to sell the house. The night before we moved, I had one last dream, or at least, I think it was a dream. I was back at the park, standing in front of the swing set. The girl was there, sitting on the swing, just like before. This time, she wasn't swaying. She was staring at me. "You can't run," she said, her voice echoing in my head. "I'll find you." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It's been years since that night, and I've moved twice since then, but I still sleep with the curtains drawn and a lamp on. Every now and then, I'll hear about strange things happening in that neighborhood. For a while, life seemed normal again. Moving to a new town gave me the fresh start I desperately needed. I started college, made new friends, and slowly pushed the memories of the girl by the swing set to the back of my mind. But deep down, I'd always felt a lingering sense of unease, like she was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until last year that I realized I hadn't escaped her. I had just moved into a small townhouse with my boyfriend, Nick. It was a cute place in a quiet neighborhood, far from the house I grew up in and even farther from that cursed park. Life was good. We were happy. Then, one evening, Nick came home holding a package. "Hey," he said, setting it on the counter. "This was on the porch for you." I frowned. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was small and unmarked, with no return address. My name was scrawled on the top in shaky, childlike handwriting. My stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" Nick asked, noticing the color drain from my face. "Probably nothing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just some prank." I opened the box, my hands trembling. Inside was a single object, a tiny swing made of twigs and string. It looked exactly like the swing set from the park. Beneath it was a scrap of paper with 4 words scrawled in the same shaky handwriting. "I told you so." I couldn't breathe. My hand shook as I shoved the box away, sending it clattering to the floor. Nick picked it up, looking puzzled. "What is this?" he asked. "Did someone send you a weird craft project?" "I don't know." I lied. "Probably some mistake." But I did know. I knew exactly who it was from. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in unnatural ways. At 3:13 a.m., the time I dreaded most, I heard it again. The creak of a swing. It wasn't outside this time. It was in the house. I woke Nick, panicking, but he insisted it was nothing. "It's an old house," he said, said, "Probably just the floorboard settling." I didn't argue, but I stayed awake, listening. The sound didn't stop until sunrise. Over the next few days, more things started happening. I'd wake up to find dirt on the floor, tiny footprints leading from the front door to our bedroom. Lights flickered constantly, and Nick's usually calm demeanor began to change. He grew irritable, distant, like something was eating away at him. One night, I found him sitting in the living room, staring at the little twig swing. "She's watching us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "The girl," he replied, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "She says it's your fault." I grabbed the swing and threw it in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. But even as it burned, I swear I heard her voice, low and guttural, like nails scraping on metal. "You can't escape me." That night, Nick left the house without a word and never came back. His car was found abandoned a few miles away, but there was no sign of him. The police said he probably just needed space, but I knew better. She had taken him. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I haven't stopped moving since. I never stay in one place for too long, and I avoid parks like the plague. But no matter where I go, I can't escape her. Last week, I got another package. Inside was another twig swing, charred at the edges. This time, the note was shorter. "See you soon." I've always loved working at the antique store in my small town. There's something about the stories behind old objects that fascinated me. It's a quiet job, and most of my time is spent cataloging items or helping the occasional customer find the perfect quirky piece for their home. But after what happened last month, I can't step foot in there again. It was a late Friday evening, and I was closing up alone. My boss had left early, trusting me to lock up. The store is quaint, filled to the brim with everything from dusty old books to mismatched china sets and eerie porcelain dolls. As I went through the usual routine, turning off the lights in each section, securing the back door, and double checking the register, something fell off. The store always had a quiet hum from the street lights outside and the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards. That night, it was different. It was too quiet. Even the hum seemed to fade, replaced by a kind of static, like white noise. While locking the display cabinet near the front of the store, I noticed something in the reflection of the glass, a shadow moving near the back. My first instinct was that someone had stayed behind after closing, maybe a customer who didn't realize we were closing up. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. No response. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, walking cautiously toward the back. As I passed rows of antique furniture and shelves of trinkets, the air grew colder. By the time I reached the back corner, I could see my breath in the air. Is someone there? I tried again, louder this time. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping noise, like fingernails on glass. It came from an old grandfather clock we had just received earlier that week. It was a beautiful piece, intricate carvings, and a pendulum that didn't move because it was broken. The tapping continued. My flashlight illuminated the glass face of the clock. I expected to see something harmless, a rat or some loose mechanism causing the sound. But instead, I saw a face. It was pressed against the glass, pale and contorted in a way that didn't seem possible. The eyes were sunken, yet they locked onto mine with a kind of malice I can't describe. The lips twisted into a grin that stretched too far, showing jagged teeth that didn't belong in a human mouth. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The face inside the clock tilted slightly, and I swear I saw its lips move. It whispered something, though I couldn't understand the words. Then the tapping stopped, and the pendulum swung. I bolted out of the store, leaving the lights, doors, and everything else. I didn't care. I just ran. The next day, my boss called me, furious that I had it locked up. I didn't tell her what I saw. How could I? I just muttered an apology and quit on the spot. A few days later, I passed by the store. It was closed, with a sign on the door saying, "Under new management." I didn't think much of it until I heard from a coworker that my boss was missing. The police found her car outside the store, but there was no sign of her, just her shoes neatly placed in front of the grandfather clock. A week after quitting, I still couldn't shake the memory of that face in the clock. My nights were restless, filled with dreams where the distorted figure crawled out of the glass, its two long fingers reaching for me. I tried to convince myself it was stress or some bizarre trick of the light, but deep down, I knew what I saw was real. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was something more to that clock. I started researching antique clocks online, hoping to find anything that could explain what I saw. After hours of scrolling through forums and obscure collector websites, I stumbled across an old post on a defunct blog. It was written by someone who claimed to have owned a clock that sounded eerily similar to the one in the store. According to the post, the clock was cursed or haunted, as the writer put it. They mentioned seeing strange faces in the glass, hearing whispers in languages they didn't understand, and experiencing a deep, unshakable dread whenever they were near it. The post ended abruptly with but the writer warning readers to stay away. There were no follow-ups. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the store. It had been a week since I left, and I told myself I just needed closure. I wasn't planning on going inside, just driving by to see if the clock was still there. Maybe if I saw it through the window, I could convince myself it was just an ordinary object, and the terror I felt was all in my head. When I pulled up to the store, my stomach dropped. The lights inside were on, but the under new management sign had been replaced with a simple closed notice. I parked across the street, debating whether to go closer when I saw movement inside. A figure was pacing back and forth, their shadow flickering in the light. It was hard to make out who it was, but they seemed agitated, their movements sharp and frantic. I watched as they stopped in front of the grandfather clock, staring at it for what felt like forever. Then they reached out and placed their hand on the glass. I don't know what I expected to happen, but it wasn't this. The person's body jerked violently like they'd been electrocuted. Their head snapped back, and they let out a soundless scream. Before I could react, they collapsed to the floor, and the lights in the store went out. I should have called the police. I should have driven away, but something compelled me to stay. Against every instinct, I crossed the street and peered through the window. The store was pitch dark, but my eyes slowly adjusted. The person was still on the ground, motionless, but the clock was glowing faintly, an unnatural, sickly green light emanating from the glass. And then I saw it. The face. It was clearer than ever, pressed against the glass, grinning at me. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more faces began to emerge, their expressions twisted in agony and rage. The glass rippled like water, and I swear I heard them whispering my name. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and ran to my car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. For a split second, I saw the face in the backseat, grinning that impossibly wide grin. I've moved to a different town now, far away from that store and that clock. But some nights, I still hear the tapping on my bedroom window, on my bathroom mirror, on the glass of my phone screen. A month passed, and I started to feel like I might be safe. The tapping on glass had become less frequent, and I began to convince myself it was all just in my head. Trauma plays tricks on the mind, right? That's what I told myself. But then, 2 nights ago, something happened that I can't explain away. I was unpacking groceries at my tiny new kitchen. It was late, and the only sounds were the hum of the fridge and the occasional car passing outside. As I reached for a glass from the cabinet, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from an unknown number. "Do you remember me?" My heart sank. It could have been spam, but something about it felt off. Before I could respond or block the number, another message came through, this time with a photo. It was a picture of the grandfather clock. The glass was cracked, and faintly, I could make out the grinning face in the reflection. I dropped the phone, my hands trembling. When I picked it up again, the message thread was gone. No trace of the number, no photo, nothing. I didn't sleep at night. I kept all the lights on and sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife, as if that could protect me from whatever was happening. But nothing came, no tapping, no whispers, no strange faces. By the next morning, I was exhausted but determined. I decided to find out where the clock was now. I had to know if someone else had taken it, if someone else was experiencing what I did. Maybe I wasn't the only one. I drove to the antique store, but when I arrived, it was boarded up. A for lease sign hung crookedly on the door. The windows were covered, but through a small gap, I could see that the place had been gutted. All the antiques were gone, and the store was empty, except for the clock. It stood in the middle of the barren room, like it had always been there. The glass was cracked just like in the photo, but the face was gone. As I stared at it, I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. The air around me grew heavier, almost suffocating. Then I felt it. A tap, not on the glass this time, but on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The street was empty. When I turned back to the window, the clock was gone. I ran to my car and drove straight home, my mind racing. I thought I was losing it, maybe I already had. But when I got home, something was waiting for me. The clock, it was standing in my living room, right in the middle of the rug. I don't know how it got there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and I lived alone. But there it was, as real as the air I was struggling to breathe. The face was back, but it was different this time. It wasn't grinning. It was staring at me with empty, hollow eyes, and its lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "It's your turn." The clock began to tick. The pendulum swung faster and faster as the face pressed harder against the glass. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whisper started again, louder now, filling my ears with a language that made my head ache. I don't remember much after that. I woke up hours later on the floor. The clock was gone, but my apartment felt rugged. The mirrors seemed to ripple when I walked past them, and the glass at my windows felt warm to the touch. Now, every night, I hear the ticking. It's faint, but it's there, like a heartbeat in the walls. I know it's not over. The clock is waiting, watching, somewhere just out of sight. If you ever come across an antique grandfather clock with a cracked face and a broken pendulum, don't touch it. Don't even look at it. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.